did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to House of Asher.
To a new episode of House of Asher on a freezing Saturday morning here in Western Kentucky. This is actually episode 73, and what I want to talk to you guys about, and the reason we have our guest on as well today, who I will give you in just a second. Again, I'm a 70s kid. Most of you guys know this at this point, but beyond things like Star Trek and all the tons of television shows and whatnot, one of my favorite shows, which came later in the person's career that we're going to be talking about today, was a show called Night Gallery. It was it was trippy. It was I would almost call it a period piece because it was so just steeped in the culture of the time. And now it would be considered very kitschy, which I don't mind. I like that for what it is. And it seems like you have two camps, and the person that we'll be discussing is Rod Serling. You either have people that are maybe, I don't say necessarily more intellectual, but they go for the stories of Twilight Zone and things like that, which are wonderful, great, timeless stories. But there's also something to be said for the sort of, well, to me, a bit more in your face of Night Gallery. It was just weird, man. It was so weird, which I know he was kind of in and out of it, and so. There's such a tumultuous life to Rod Serling, and I'm lucky enough to have a gentleman who is a Rod Serling-ologist. I don't know if that's a technical thing or not, but Nick Parisi, hey man, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. I'm glad to be with you.
Okay, like I said, I hope you didn't fall asleep with that long intro.
That's all right. I like Serling-ologist. That's a good one.
That's okay. Well, see, that's the thing. If I actually put more time into it, I would probably want to be a Kolchakologist. I actually, when I was a little bitty kid, I used to have like the little hat. I had got a hat of my dad's and put the press card in it and run around with the top. I was such a dork. But anyway,
I know a Kolchakologist actually.
Was it right? Well, put me in touch with him. I'd like to have him on.
I will. I will.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of ask your origin story. I always ask people their origin stories. Were you always into Rod Serling and the stories of that he had brought to the screen, which we can get into that as well, because he was connected with Planet of the Apes and wrote the screenplay, the way I understand it. What brought you to this lowly state?
well, yes. I mean, for like most people, the Twilight Zone was what did it for me. I started watching the Twilight Zone here in New York. I live on Long Island, and there's a station here, WPIX, that aired the Twilight Zone at 1 o'clock in the morning when I was a kid. At 9, when I was 9 or 10 years old, and believe it or not, I would stay up. I would stay up and at least try to watch it at 1 o'clock in the morning. This is on school nights, and I would often make it. And they would also play it on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning, also occasionally. But from the moment I saw that show, I was just hooked. I was mesmerized by it. It was just one of those things that it drew me in immediately, and I became a fanatic for it. And again, this is when I was about 10 years old, and when I was about 12 years old, that's when Mark Zicree's Twilight Zone Companion came out. And for your listeners, if they don't know, Mark Zicree's Twilight Zone Companion was truly a revolutionary book. It really was. It was the first book to really take a television series and analyze it in such a fashion, in a show by show fashion. And it made you feel like after you read that book, like you were an expert on that particular series. And I don't think there was ever another book that did that, where you read that book and you felt like, okay, I know everything there is to know about this show. Of course you didn't, but that's the way it felt. And so that kind of turned me into an even more fanatic. And then basically what happened is, over the years, I just very gradually became aware of all this other great stuff that Rod Serling had written before the Twilight Zone and after the Twilight Zone, and I just became fanatical about trying to get information about all of these different shows, and eventually it turned into this book.
And it's such a cultural thing, because I mean, anybody who's watched some of the stuff. there's so many, I mean, like even in comedy, like The Simpsons and things like that, they borrow from that and do kind of homages to all that. Because Rod had such a delivery, especially when he did narration and things like that, which was really strange because I knew he was from a small town in New York, and
Mhm.
it seemed like a lot of that still come through. It seemed like I knew that he was a World War II veteran, I think a paratrooper.
He
Is that
was,
correct?
yes, right, yes, that's correct.
And it always seemed like I don't know if it was that obviously he had to grow quickly. I didn't know if maybe he's trying to sort of revive that or refine that innocence in some of that because it always seemed like there was a moral tale, especially in the Twilight Zone stuff.
Well, that's yeah, that is you're on the right track there. Absolutely. I mean, I addressed this in the book in some detail. It was absolutely he grew up in a town called Binghamton, New York. As I said, I'm on Long Island, and that's Binghamton's about a 4-hour drive from here, and I've been there plenty of times, and he had this desire to recapture that innocence of his childhood in Binghamton, and that's primarily because of World War II, because the day after high school graduation, he was barely 18 years old, and he went off to fight. He joined the paratroopers, and part of the appeal of being a paratrooper for Rod Serling was that he kind of glamorized the idea of jumping out of an airplane. I mean, he was a bit of a daredevil, and he was a macho guy, even though he was 5'4" tall and weighed 118 pounds when he joined the army. But he liked that idea of being heroically jumping out of an airplane. But the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which he was assigned to, was really used as an infantry. So he went into combat. He went to the Pacific Theater, the Philippines, Lady in Luzon, and he saw some major combat, and he came back scarred by it, and it affected the rest of his life in his work and in his personal life. And he just, he did address that idea of trying to go back to his innocence to before the war over and over again in the Twilight Zone and out of the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, I think for which, as you know, as being a writer, the sort of books, I don't know if you know this, but I've written books about my experiences in working in penitentiaries and places that were reputedly haunted and stuff. You everyone brings a little touch of themselves. It's like if you ask someone to draw a picture or to make a sculpture, a lot of times people make something that looks similar to themselves or something that they know. I don't know if it's necessarily true. I don't know if there is any real original thought. I think we have an amalgamation of different things that we've experienced or that we glamorize or whatever. If we're making something scary, we're going to make it something that's scary to us, something that's monstrous to us. Like, take like the good lord, like the 1930s and 1940s. Every villain looked like. I mean, the Merciless. He was Asian.
Yes.
It was blatantly. I'm not saying that he was racist. I'm not saying that at all. But I mean, a lot of times people take what is their fear. Star Wars. All the stormtroopers look like Nazis. Even the helmets, for
Of
God's
course.
sakes. So you take that high,
Oh, Steve, I think I lost you. Are you there? Oh, hello. I can hear me.
Are we back?
Hello.
Are we there?
Oh, I hear you now. What happened?
Hey, live radio. I think the Gremlins didn't want me talking about this, but
Yeah, could be.
I'm sorry, but no, yeah. What I'm just saying, and that really does seem that, he does wear his innocence heart on his sleeve like that. Something that was interesting to me, and I'm not for sure if he actually held a title or not, but I'm not trying to make this a Night Stalker thing, but he and also the guy who played Kolchak were both weren't they like featherweights?
Rod was yes, he was. They called it a catchweight at the time, but I believe it was exactly the same as a featherweight. Yeah.
Right. See, it's so strange to me because to me he was like that kind of 50s, like I'm trying to word this because I don't want it to come off sounding negative, but it sort of he has a weird mix of sort of the 50s like Mad Men kind of look and vibe and that kind of the intellectual thing, but he also has that blue collar element too, which is really strange because a lot of times maybe people move to the coast or whatever, especially out west or something, they kind of change it up a little bit and you have to play down your roots a lot. And it's just such a strange thing. I never would have taken him for that. I always saw him as sort of the big city guy, and it's really interesting. You've brought like different facets to this guy who really rounds him out as a person.
Yeah, well, he did have both those aspects. You're absolutely right. He was a small town guy growing up in Binghamton, but he loved cities. When early in his career, he did say that New York City scared the hell out of him. But he was the type of guy he was a very worldly guy, so he did love cities. At the same time, he kind of had this dichotomy there. But yes, and the suit and the tie, and he was very very suave. So, I'm looking for the right word, but you know what I'm saying. And he had that image, and he had that presence, and he came across as, he did have a way of coming across as your best buddy, but also as this kind of what he would say, this omniscient narrator of these particular stories.
Right, and that was for me, if I'm not mistaken. Initially, they wanted Twilight Zone to be a different thing, because like you said, he had like before that, I think it was patterns and a few other things that were kind of like preamble or start and jumps going toward Twilight Zone. Exactly how did he end up becoming the narrator on it? Was because at first they were going to have someone else, didn't they?
Well, not really. That's actually one of the myths that I kind of address in the book, is that they Serling was kind of well, first of all, it was his show. I mean, he was the producer and he created it. And by the time that Twilight Zone debuted, he had really built a name for himself where he could call those shots about everything on this particular series. And he wanted to be the narrator pretty much from the get-go. But when they did the first pilot, they did have somebody else narrate the pilot, and that pilot is that alternate pilot is available on the DVD sets that have been released. But it was Westbrook Van Voorhees who did the original pilot, but they kind of knew that he was never going to be the permanent guy. They just that was clearly temporary. And then Rod took over after the show got picked up. But what happened actually was, after the first season, when the first season was done, during the first season, Rod was never on screen. He was only heard. The narrations were voiceover. And after the first season, the network, CBS, said, maybe if we get an on-screen presence, it might jazz this thing up a little bit, give it a little excitement, and maybe we could get Orson Welles to do this. So it was after the first season that they threw this name around, Orson Welles, and Rod Serling was actually booked on a flight to London to go meet with Orson Welles to talk about it. And honestly, I don't know if he completed that flight, because what happened was basically, the network was already trying to cut the budget on the show, and they weren't about to spend the money to get a name person like Orson Welles to do it. So again, Rod was like, I'll go on screen, I'll do it, and he did it cheap, and so it was kind of the best of both worlds, because he really did want to do it, and the network wanted somebody on screen, so Rod got the job.
Well, I know just in some of the documentaries and stuff that I've seen, it seemed like it was that almost like old school, where you have like the angry lieutenant, and you're a maverick, you're a wild card, and then it's like whatever, and he does what he kind of wants, and there's this back and forth, and I swear I'm gonna this type of thing back and forth, and it always seems like he was always sort of at odds with the studios, and because it seems like they were thinking very lowbrow on a lot of this stuff. And even, and I know I'm kind of jumping fandoms, and I apologize, but like I know like in Star Trek, that they wanted a sort of a thing, which doesn't really tie in so much with him, but they wanted kind of like a wagon train in the stars, so that it was all we have to have a couple fights, and we have to have some hotties in it, and we have to have, and for the most part, he really threw that out. He took a whole different vein with it, and with guys like Asimov and people like that were touching off into sci-fi, it really created a whole new world of television, and which then, of course, that was aped by everybody. You had stuff like Thriller and some of the early, or was it Chiller or Thriller?
Well, there was both, actually. They were both, yeah.
What was the one that Boris Karloff did?
That was Thriller. Thriller.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, but it was always it was more of a gothic thing. It always stayed kind of entrenched in kind of Lovecraftian, Poish kind of, and I know I'm butchering these words, but it wasn't until he kind of, but don't get me wrong, he touched on that. One of my favorite episodes, I believe it was the episode with Roddy McDowall, and where he basically got his uncle killed, so he gets the house, and he has to keep this picture on the wall.
Right.
and which that was not a Twilight, but that was a
That was an episode of the original Night
Night
Gallery.
Gallery.
Yeah, and
That's
it was
it.
the pilot film. And it was the first episode of
Right.
the pilot film. Yep.
And for me, I mean, like I said, which that did touch on elements of the Gothic, and then you have
Oh,
like
definitely.
all that stuff. But if you had to pick one, which obviously To Serve Man and all the different ones, was it All the Time in the World where the guy busts his glasses after the world ends and all this? What episode would you say if you had to pick one, or if you already, let's do it like this: if you had to pick three of those that you say, okay, these are the ones that I think stand alone in their importance, be it culturally, racially, what?
You mean 3 episodes of the Twilight Zone?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, it is hard to pick one, but if I had to pick three, I mean, in terms of various reasons, I would say the first one that I would pick, for any reason really, and this isn't to say it's my favorite. It's probably in my top five, but maybe not my favorite. Is The Eye of the Beholder. Eye of the Beholder to me is the quintessential Twilight Zone episode. That's the one episode that is my answer to, if the Martians came down and wanted to know what the Twilight Zone is, I would give them that episode, because that episode has pretty much everything that the Twilight Zone is about in one episode. It's a great morality tale. It has a great twist ending. It is the cinematography of it, the look of it is Twilight Zone to a T. It's exactly what the Twilight Zone should look like, and it's got great makeup effects for the monsters, quote unquote. So that's the one that I would say just to be quintessential Twilight Zone. I would take that one. After that, I would say my personal favorite at this point in time, anyway, is Rod Serling's Walking Distance. Walking Distance is one of Rod's, as we were talking about before, one of his meditations on trying to go back to his childhood. It's about a burnt out business executive who wants to go back to his hometown, and he does. He goes back in time and meets himself as a young boy, and kind of tries to convince his younger self to cherish his childhood while it lasts. And it's one of those sentimental stories that happens to be not schmaltzy to me, at least in the least. It's authentically emotional, and it gets me every time I see it. So that would be the quintessential Serling episode to me. If you want to know what Rod Serling was all about, that would be it. And then after those two, I might say something like, if I had to pick something from another writer, I guess I could say Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, the Richard Matheson episode, William Shatner and the Gremlin on the Wing, only because that is a real good example of the scares of the Twilight Zone, the horror aspect of the Twilight Zone, especially because it is a psychological horror. Most of the fear in that particular episode is going on in William Shatner's head, in Bob Wilson's head, about whether or not he's going crazy, and does he really see the gremlin on the wing? Is it really there? And Shatner gives a terrific performance. I mean, anybody criticizes Shatner's acting, I mean, just watch that episode. He's terrific in it.
Yeah,
and
anybody that wants to talk down Mr. William Shatner needs to shut their dirty face.
I'm with you on that. Yeah. So those are the three I think I would pick. But in the book, what I do actually is I do rate the Twilight Zone episodes, every one of them, on a 3-star scale. And the reason I use the 3-star scale is because there's something that Serling had said once. He said that there are about a third of the episodes are ones that I'm proud to be a part of. About a third of them are passable, and about a third of them are dogs. That's basically where he broke it down. So I said, you know what, I'll rate them with 1, 2, or 3 stars, no halves or anything else. I just do 1, 2, and 3, and I ended up coming up. I rated 49 episodes at 3 stars, at the highest rating, and much less than 1/3 1 stars. I mean, I think he was much too critical on that end. I don't think there's nearly that terrible episodes of the series.
Well, I mean, that's also coming from a workaholic, very, very self-critical person, which I'm saying that with the best of admiration. It's one of those things you can either, excuse my language, half-ass it, or you can knuckle down and try to put something that's of quality. I mean, are you like you said, putting out schmaltz, or you're trying to do art, or trying to do something that's going to mean something? I know for me, well, two things. We were talking about the suspense aspect. I forgot who said it. It may have been Hitchcock that said, if you're watching something and there's a bomb and it goes off, and it's noisy and boom, and you don't know anything about it, that's scare, that's a shock, but if you know it's there and you're waiting for it to go off and then it finally goes, that's suspense. and
Exactly right.
and I think that's something that he brought to the small screen that for more or less wasn't there. I mean, you'd have things like Dark Shadows and things like that, and but all in all, it was kind of like variety shows. I mean, which coming up in the '70s, I loved some of that stuff. But man, some of the crazy mishmash stuff, which then again, Night Gallery was kind of like that too, throwing some of the weird, quirky characters of the age on there. So
Well, Twilight Zone, Twilight Zone was, it was a unique show in many, many ways. It really did revolutionize uh, television to a large extent, and part of it was that the Twilight Zone stories did cover the gamut of everything. I mean, they were science fiction, they were fantasy, they were horror, they were comedy, there were westerns, there were futuristic stories. It really did cover everything, and that was Rod Serling's intent from the get go, was to have this broad canvas to paint on. So there was that, and Night Gallery followed that up pretty much the same way. And when you're doing that, of course, you're going to get a mixed bag. You're going to get some bad episodes along with the good, but it's ambitious. And Rod Serling, one of the things that he was his own worst critic. There's no doubt about that. He was so harsh on his own work and everything. But one thing he would always say about the Twilight Zone is that they always shot for the best. They always tried to achieve the quality. And sometimes they failed, but if they failed trying to get something really qualitative, as he would say, on the screen, and usually they succeeded.
I know that, and as we get deeper into this, I want to make sure that you put out any anything. Well, in fact, if you want to, if you have any of your web pages and stuff, kind of off the top of your head, feel free to go ahead and mention them. We'll mention them again later in the show.
I appreciate it. Well, first of all, the book is called Rod Serling, My Life. Rod Serling, My Life. Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination. And it's available pretty much anywhere books are sold, but it's on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com, and you should be able to find it on the bookshelves at local stores. I have a Facebook page that's dedicated to the book, so it's not my personal page. It is dedicated to the book, and so you can find that at Facebook.com, and it's /Rod Serling Dimensions. That's the Facebook page for the book. And I also mentioned that I serve on the board of directors of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation. It's a charity that is dedicated to preserving and promoting Rod Serling's legacy. And if people want to find out more about that, they can just go to rodserling.com, and you'll find out lots more about the foundation.
That was actually going to be one of my next questions about the foundation. I mean, all right, you have fans, and then you have kind of like borderline cuckoo fans that are like dangerous, and then you actually have people that are like yourself who are trying to organize this and almost make like the Serling library of work, and this is really awesome. I'd like to see more of that type of
Sure.
thing.
That's pretty much what the foundation is dedicated to.
That's awesome. How in the world did you go about even starting that?
Well, I didn't start it, actually. The foundation has been around since the mid-'80s, and it was actually started primarily by one of Rod's biggest or earliest mentors, Helen Foley. It's a name most Serling aficionados have heard before. Helen Foley was one of Rod's middle school teachers. She taught him public speaking, and they were lifelong friends after that. She became Rod Serling's biggest champion after he left school, and so she started it, actually, and the foundation has been instrumental in getting a star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame for Rod Serling. They were able to get a Twilight Zone stamp done some years ago. There is a marker outside of the Binghamton High School now to mark it as the Rod Serling's high school. So there's all sorts of things around Binghamton, and we're working on a lot of things now that we hope to get accomplished. And so I just became involved as a fan. Really, I just reached out to them saying, "Listen, I'd like to help. I'd like to help do this," and that was pretty much it just went from there.
Well, it's a thing that so many people just don't think about their influence on a small child, and it's one of those. This is a perfect example of something that can come so positive from a positive mentor and someone taking the time to really positively influence the interest of a child. And it's great that he took the time to always give the respect and props, I guess, as the kids say today. I don't know if kids still say props, but that says a lot about his character.
Oh yeah, he was a very generous guy. very outgoing guy. And he was, one thing I did in researching this book was I was able to go through all of his correspondence. I mean, he kept all his letters, and this was a guy who you would think he responded to every fan letter he ever got his entire life. I mean, he responded to everything. He wrote personalized letters signed to people who wrote to him about anything, and good or bad. I mean, he would probably more apt to respond if you criticized something. Really, he would respond, and he was just that way. If you listen to anybody talk who had any interactions with him, particularly like students, because he did a lot of teaching, but students and people of that area, they will all tell you that he was when you talk to the guy, he listened to you. He would look you in the eye, and he would take into account what you were saying, and he just was not the Hollywood phony type of guy. He really was very, very down to earth when it came to a one-on-one interaction with people.
Well, let me ask you something, and I mean, and you may have an opinion on it, you may not. I'm not trying to step too far away from your books, but the ripple effect of Serling is massive. And as we'd mentioned, he did, I believe, the original screenplay for Planet of the Apes, and I know that people that are not as familiar with that, there was a book out. I won't get too much into it, but there's a comedian named Dana Gould, and he is like a flippin' complete nut for Planet of the Apes and Serling and all that, and does a great podcast, Dana Gould podcast, plug. And anyway, and they'd worked together and did storyboards, and it became a graphic novel, and it talks about the way that his vision, being Rod's, for Planet of the Apes were, which is really kind of weird and surreal. And it has the apes and the gorillas, and they're getting on the L train, and they're going here and there, and they got their briefcases, and it's like gorilla madmen, sort of.
yeah.
And it's really trippy. And how do you think there would have been? First of all, do you think that would have sold? Do you think that gorilla madmen would have sold in regards of putting it together in a movie, or do you think it would have been too far out?
Well, at the time, it didn't sell. Is the bottom line, and the reason it didn't sell was partly was because of the budget. There just was to put apes in that setting, to have them dressed in suits and in towers and in real cities and driving cars and that kind of thing. The budget just wouldn't have been, for the time. They were already worried about the budget, and that would have just skyrocketed it. What happened with Planet of the Apes, and I'll give an even better plug hopefully for that graphic novel. It's from Boom Studios, and it's a terrific graphic novel. It's based on Serling's earlier drafts of the screenplay, and it really does give you a great idea of what Serling's vision for the Planet of the Apes would have looked like. And I think when you read it now, I think, it would have worked. It would have been a different movie, but it would have worked. But what happened was that, Serling had been involved with the Planet of the Apes project for about 2.5 years. And he had written several drafts. I go through this in the book that, it kind of depends on how you count, but he wrote anywhere from 3 to 40 drafts. I mean, so he was writing a lot on that project. And after that 2.5 years, when they realized, listen, we're going to have to cut the budget on this thing. We're going to have to set this thing in kind of a semi-civilized setting. He and the producers were not satisfied with his drafts. I mean, they wanted the dialogue to be spiced up, and they weren't satisfied. So it was kind of a mutual thing where he did step aside. They hired Michael Wilson to come in, and Michael Wilson rewrote Serling's dialogue almost completely. He came in and he took Serling's draft, and he kind of kept the same structure, and a lot of the visuals are the same that Serling had in his drafts, and a lot of the plot points are the same. But he rewrote almost all of the dialogue, and that really and he changed the setting, obviously, and that is what ended up on the screen. And so they got co-credit. It's Michael Wilson, screenplay by Michael Wilson and Rod Serling, and that's the way it should be. They really did do kind of equal parts in different ways of that particular screenplay.
Well, I'm trying to think of is it Beneath the Planet of the Apes? Is that the one where they were worshiping the bomb, and they had the humans that were all like they were albinos and
they were mutants. They were mutants. Yeah, that was the second one, and I think it was Beneath the Planet of the Apes. I think that's the name of that one. Yeah, and the interesting thing about that is, I mentioned this in the book, is that Rod pretty much immediately after the original Planet of the Apes premiered and was already a big hit, or it was just clear that this was going to be a huge movie. He got together with the producers almost immediately to start pitching sequel ideas. and none of his ideas were used. But well, I really shouldn't say it, because what I was going to say was one of the sequel ideas that he had ended with the detonation of a bomb and destroying the planet, and that's essentially what they used in the second film. The Charlton Heston character destroys the planet with a nuclear bomb. So, Serling did say, I had nothing to do with any of the sequels, but apparently that may have lodged somewhere, because they did use that idea in the second one.
Well, and the thing is, for me, these movies mean different things as I age, because I'm 49 now, and watching it as a 10-year-old, and you're kind of like, oh, look, there's talking monkeys, and then like you're 13 or 14, and going, hey, check out Nova, she's pretty hot, and then it just goes on and goes on, and it morphs and changes, and you've got the guy to know, don't trust anybody, it's over 30, and like the little peed off
Right.
teen monkey and having a bad day and whatever. But when I did see that particular film, and I don't want to get too far from Twilight Zone, but I know that it had certain Serling qualities to it, and that's why I was going, yeah, I think he had more of a hand in that than maybe he was credited with. And
Yeah.
it seems later in his life that I don't know if he sort of, I mean, because he, like you said, he was a workaholic and stuff, which I think in part probably ended his life early, and
That was that was part of it, I think. Yeah,
yeah,
that contributed.
sure. And I'm trying to remember. There was an actor, and I'm blanking on the gentleman's name, but he was in doing some show, and the guy wasn't really eating into this and that. And he says, "Look," he said, "here's the deal." He said, "I worked with Rod Serling, great guy, pretty much was living on coffee and cigarettes, for the last 1 or 2 years of his life." He says, and he died very young. Yeah, wonderful guy, and he died too early.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that was all the work-related stress and all the I wish I could haves and maybe ifs and.
I think it all. I think it all came together. He was an intense cigarette smoker, as anybody who's watched anything with him could tell you. He was addicted, unfortunately, and he just smoked. He was a chain smoker, and that certainly had a huge part of it, and played a huge part in his death. And he was addicted to stress too. I think he was a workaholic, and he worked 16-hour days on the Twilight Zone, and he never stopped writing. He just wrote and wrote and wrote just continuously, and the body of work that he left behind is massive and unbelievable. I mean, it's literally when I went through it, not just the stuff that was produced, but the stuff that wasn't produced. To think that one person could have created all of this is just beyond belief. I don't know how he did it. I don't know how anybody could have done it.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems. It's so strange because, like you said, he was such a driven man, and not only, of course, his screenwriting work, his television production, narration, and all that. I know he was a playwright as well. So it's like I don't know when this guy had time for Lord anything, his family or anything, and it had to have taken a toll on all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But that also shows you his dedication to his craft. Is that, and it's not a thing. I think some people feel that. Well, this guy, not so much him, but a person like that, especially these days, it's sort of different. It's to where it's like, well, why is he so far away from this and that? Some people don't have a choice on that. Some people are so driven by their muse of whatever. You have to write. You have to.
Yeah,
produce.
I think he was compelled. He said that he was wasn't that he succumbed to writing. It was a compulsion, and that he just kind of gave into it, and that's what he had to do. You're right. He had no choice. He really didn't. And I make the point in the book that I think that, again, I think the war was part of it. I think that he had gone through such a traumatic time and seen so many of his buddies get killed young, these guys dying young. And while he was in the service, his father died at the age of 52, and he came back from the war just feeling like I make the argument that I think he wanted to stamp his name in the earth as many times as possible, say I was here, and he just that's why he just wrote and wrote and wrote continuously and compulsively, because he just was intent on making that mark, and he did, and he made his mark.
Right. I think a lot of that comes from the and I'm going to blank on the word, and I apologize. We all know how Quicksilver-esque life is, just how in 3 seconds a life that was normal and this and that and wholesome and whatever can turn on a dime with the death of a parent or a child, and you're never the same. And at best, you find something to keep yourself busy, to keep yourself focused. And I'm sure with everything he had going on, I'm sure he suffered some PTSD, or I guess shell shock back in the time from losing all the people in such a short amount of time and all the horrors of war that he's seen. It's just good that he maybe had that to fall back on, or he may have. Who knows what it may have done.
Well, that's exactly, he I don't think there's any question that he did suffer from PTSD. He had the symptoms of it for the rest of his life, and he admitted that he started writing as a form of therapy. That is why he began writing, because he wanted to get some of this stuff out, get the trauma out onto the page. So that is what started him, and then it just blossomed from there.
Right. And I don't know how many other artists so much like that. I mean, I think obviously a lot of people get into this and that, and maybe they have a love of writing, or an interest in it, or maybe shows a certain amount of aptitude, or maybe they're going, well, hey, I got a cousin out on the coast here and there. Maybe I can get a good script. Maybe you can throw it out there, and I can get a nice whatever guitar-shaped pool like Elvis or whatever. And but it seemed like his motivations were so different. It was almost like he was running away from something dark that was just chasing him through his life, and he was a really conflicted kind of character. And it's strange. You look at him. I look at him in different ways. I look at him in admiration as an incredible producer and artist, and all around generally good-hearted man from what everybody has said. But also you have to, I don't want to say you have to pity him, but there's a certain element of anybody who's had loss. You look at somebody like that and it's like, I wonder how this would have colored his work. Say if something hadn't happened, maybe he would have been writing musicals. Maybe could you imagine a Rod Serling musical? So,
well, believe it or not, he kind of did. Believe it or not,
really.
Very late in his life, he one of the last real big hits that he had was a show called A Storm in Summer. It was written for Hallmark Hall of Fame, and it was a terrific show. It starred oh boy, I'm gonna mess up his name now. Peter Ustinov. It's about an old Jewish man in upstate New York who suddenly becomes kind of caretaker for a 10-year-old black kid from Harlem, and it's about the relationship that these two people develop. And it was a big hit in terms of the ratings and in terms of the response, and he actually developed it as a musical with Steve Allen, who was a comedian and a musician, and they wrote a musical together, and it was never produced. But after it was not produced, Serling then went back and just kind of rewrote it as a straight dramatic stage play, and that was produced in San Diego it was actually called the Off-Broadway Theater, and that was produced. But the musical has never seen the light of day, and that would have been very, very interesting.
Well, Peter Ustinov also was in Logan's Run and Spartacus, which you have to say Spartacus, and all these other big films for me anyway. Spartacus was huge for people at the time. I loved Logan's Run just because I was a sci-fi geek. But it's so like I said, it's so weird how many different ripples and crossovers and how all of this kind of ties in together. I think you could probably do the 6 Degrees of Rod Serling. It can make a lot of different people.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, sure. Especially because he wrote so much that it's amazing. If you pick somebody, they were in a Rod Serling from that era. They were in a Rod Serling script at some point because he just wrote so much for so many different series.
What do you think if, let's just say, in an alternate universe or whatever, if perhaps he had been able to battle some of the demons and come to grips with some of that, and what might he have produced, and what are some things that you know of that is written that obviously we talked about the screenplay or the play. Are there the lost episodes of this or the lost scripts of that? I'm sure there's probably a storage shed full of stuff like that.
There really is, and he left behind many completed teleplays and screenplays that were not produced for various reasons. I mean, some of them are not good. Some of them, you write that much, and you're going to write some bad stuff as well. So some of them are not good, but plenty of them are very good, and almost all of them have potential. So yeah, there's a lot of that stuff. I mean, as far as Twilight Zone goes, the one major one that was not produced was the original pilot that Serling had written called The Happy Place. That some people may have heard of from other publications. But the first pilot really the second pilot, and that's a whole other story. But the first pilot that he wrote was called The Happy Place. It's set in a dystopian future where the elderly and the sick are euthanized. And by elderly in this case, I think it's like 60 is the people are killed at 60, and you're thinking probably of Logan's Run now too. But
right.
yeah, but people are euthanized at 60, and it's about a man who works at the place where they're put to death, and his son is becoming indoctrinated into this way of thinking, and basically it ends with the son being so indoctrinated and just becoming so fanatical that he finally gets to the point where he says, the age really should be younger than 60. It should be 55, and the dad is 54 at the time. And he said, hey, it's almost time for you, Dad. Like how that's Serling saying how it's going to get worse. Once you get into this pattern, it's going to get worse. So that was one, and the other one that I bring up in the book, and this was one of the great discoveries that I had, was that Serling wrote a feature-length screenplay version of the Twilight Zone episode "It's a Good Life," with the episode with Anthony Fremont, who's the terrible 6-year-old boy who has the godlike powers and can send people to the cornfield and everything. He took that. This was very shortly before his death in 1974. He wrote a feature-length screenplay of that episode that starts at the beginning, starts with Anthony's birth and goes through that episode of the Twilight Zone and ends beyond that episode. So that's the one that I'm amazed. It's very good, and I was the first 2/3 of it I think are terrific. The ending leaves a little bit to be desired, but that's a screenplay that I cannot believe is still sitting on the shelf. Somebody should have done something with it by now, and maybe they will now that it's kind of seen the light of day, at least in my book anyway.
Right. Well, see, that was what I was going to ask. Is that I know I don't know how many of his descendants are still with us. But
Two.
I mean,
yeah. Well, his two daughters and his girl, Carol, is still with us actually too. She's 90 years old, I think, and she's still with us.
Well, I don't know. It's also one of these things that maybe they're just like they don't want to see any more damage done on him, maybe, or whatever. But I mean, I think that there are some people that would do it in the style, which I think you would have to do it in that style for it to come across. I'm not saying I wouldn't want to throw like Abrams on it or something with a bunch of flashes across the screen every 2 seconds. I'm not trying to dog him. It's just he's not Rod Serling. But take someone who grew up on that and understands that, and it would be great if they could get some of the same people that did a lot of the production or camera work and things like that, which I guess it would be about impossible at this point unless they were teenage kids. But
yeah. But listen, there would certainly be a way to do it. There's no way, no doubt about it. There'll be a way to do it in that style. And this particular screenplay, it's like I said, it was written in 1974, so it was set in 1974, so it could be done in that style, more of a night gallery really than the Twilight Zone. Even though it was a Twilight Zone episode initially, it's more set in the night gallery setting anyway. So I think that would be the way to do it.
Right, and I think it would be easier to, like, because they were talking about. I've heard people talk about trying to do like a new Twilight Zone reboot and whatnot, and I'm thinking that's gonna stink. But good luck. I hope it does well. But I would have to see something to really dazzle me because it's such a high bar. But I think you could do a night gallery easier for the fact that I'm not saying that the expectations are lower, but I think it's a thing of it poked fun a little bit more on certain things. It was a little bit looser on certain things. I think. Well, I'm just saying, not that it didn't have some really dark elements too, but I think it was just a different animal, for the time.
It was. They listen. Yeah, Night Gallery and Twilight Zone certainly were different animals. They get compared all the time though, because it's just for obvious reasons. I mean, they're both anthologies, and they're both primarily written by Rod Serling and hosted by Rod Serling. So it's kind of impossible not to compare them. But they are different animals for sure.
If you had to, if there were, things in anthologies that are current that. I'm not saying necessarily even hold a light, but are definitely influenced by Rod's work. Mirrors being one, at least in my view.
Black Mirror, yeah.
Black Mirrors, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm walking over
Well,
you.
no, that's okay. Yeah, Black Mirror is the one that people always bring up, and I have to be honest with you. I've only seen 3 episodes of it, the first 3 episodes, and I can certainly see the reason that is compared, but I haven't quite got to the point where it really warrants that comparison, honestly. But again, I've only seen the first 3 episodes, and I hope to catch up on that. But honestly, the place where Rod Serling's influence is felt even more, I think, is just in straight drama and straight dramatic series. The people like Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad, he is a Serling. He loves Serling. Serling is. He said he was the. They asked him who's the one writer who would invite into your writers' room, and Vince said Rod Serling. David Chase, The Sopranos. He same thing. David Chase made patterns. Serling's patterns required viewing for the cast for the crew of Mad Men. Because he wanted them to see what that period of time was, how it was presented, at least through Rod Serling's eyes. David Simon, The Wire, he's a Serling aficionado. Guillermo del Toro, brilliant director. He's a Night Gallery fanatic, love Night Gallery. So these guys, they're all indebted to Rod Serling, and again, it's in that straight drama really area. Although Guillermo del Toro's working in the fantasy realm, of course, but
Right.
but yeah, but yeah, in terms of the Twilight Zone, you mentioned, yeah, there is going to be a new Twilight Zone reboot on CBS All Access that's coming next year, 2019. Jordan Peele is in charge of it, and I'm cautiously optimistic about it. I hope that it works. I loved Get Out. I think that's a terrific movie, and I think Jordan Peele is clearly a talent, and so I'm kind of happy that he's in charge of it. So I'm cautiously optimistic about that. And then just yesterday, actually, I heard the news that a Night Gallery reboot is in the works as well for the Sci-Fi Channel. So Sci-Fi Channel does not have a great track record, I think, in terms of their production value and things like that. But again, they're going to give it a shot, and so it's just another little bit of Rod Serling coming back to the screen. Those two shows, as you mentioned, we both mentioned the graphic novel of the Planet of the Apes, his version of the Planet of the Apes. My book just came out. I mean, so I feel like there's a Rod Serling resurgence on right now.
There's a how do I say this? We have a tendency to protect our babies and protect our safe places. What we consider golden moments in our childhood and stuff. Sometimes to our detriment. I know I'm not a huge. I'm not a huge fan of modern like reboots and things like that, but my kids had always grew up watching like the modern versions of like 13 Ghosts and House on Haunted Hill and all that, which was like William Castle classics, and
Yes.
which I grew up on that. Obviously in reruns, but grew up on all that and the Ed Wood stuff, and Toby Hooper, Salem's Lot and whatnot. And so they watched those shows, and then I watched these other ones. This is like the same movie. I said, this is the original. And they're like, oh,
Yeah,
so,
and
so
usually, obviously, the original better. Usually.
well, no, honestly, I watched the newer ones like I think probably watched those on like Creature Feature with the Count of Five out of Nashville, like at my horror host as a kid, but as of some of those, I grew up with on like television movies like Salem's Lot. I watched that and Carrie and all that before I ever started reading Mr. King's books, but they knew that from that, and then they tried to do some reboots of some of those, and it just didn't fly. But there have been some that have been very, very well done. I thought the Poltergeist was different because it wasn't an exact remake, and they took some characters out and they amalgamated some, so it was a little bit of a different take. I apologize, but the Ghostbusters movie stunk. I don't think I'm gonna have too much argument for too many people. Not because it was anything to do with women, but just because I didn't. I think you kind of threw out the original vibe. I think if it had been continuation, or it had been Daughters or Sons of, or they were in somehow like the next generation, like an X-Men, New Mutants kind of thing. I know I'm getting kind of comic book nerd deep, but
Yeah, that could have worked. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they're supposed to be coming out with a new one of that. I know I'm jumping all over. I apologize, but there's ways of doing it, ways of not. I think if they do it very much in respect of Rod and take the heart and soul of it, but modernize it, because it's just going to. There's certain things you can't do. If you're driving down the street and you got a cell phone, anybody can get a hold of you. It's not like, oh, I'm totally out of touch. They have to modernize certain things, but like yourself, I'm guardedly optimistic, and especially of the night gallery thing, because that was just my jams as a kid. I love that. So, and which now I used to would watch some of that with my mom, who's now passed, and that for me, like Twilight Zone was more of like my mom still. So there's that
I hear.
there's that connection, you know. But I'll tell you what, in the last couple minutes we got um, two things. What do you think Rod would think of like some of the current treatments of stuff of what he's done and the sort of the legacy that he's left? Obviously, I think he would dig it, but is there something like I always have this idea like as an epitaph is like I wasn't done yet, you know. I had a few more stories.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I think in terms of I wasn't done yet. I think what he would have, what I how I would put that is, Rod Serling ended his life really kind of thinking that he didn't accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. Unfortunately, he really felt like a failure in a lot of ways, and that's really sad to say because, I dedicate this book with a one sentence dedication. I said this book is for Rod Serling. He left monuments. And the reason I said that is because it was a play on something that Rod Serling had said once. He said that, all of us leave behind ruins or monuments. And at the end of his life, I don't think he realized how many monuments he left behind. He thought he left some ruins behind. And so one of his, great dreams was to be a produced Broadway playwright, and that never came to fruition. He never had a Broadway play produced. Requiem for a Heavyweight was produced after he died. It came to Broadway, and it opened and closed very quickly, unfortunately. But he never saw a Broadway play of his produced in his lifetime. Another goal that he had was to write a good novel, and he never wrote a good novel. He never published a novel. Period. He may have completed some. That's a whole other story. There may have been a couple that were lost, but so he never accomplished that. And so yes, he felt like he still had things to accomplish when he died. And I think he would be amazed though at the legacy he has left behind. He'd be amazed at the popularity of the Twilight Zone. He'd be amazed at the influence that it has had on other filmmakers and other writers. He would absolutely be thrilled about that. And I think he'd also be amazed at the state of television today. I think we're very much kind of accustomed to bashing television, and a lot of times it deserves it, of course. But I think Rod Serling would be amazed at how adult drama is now on television. How he was writing in a time where just being adult, just handling adult subject matter was pretty much verboten. I mean, he couldn't go in certain areas. He couldn't write about certain things. And I think you'd be amazed that pretty much on television today, not just cable, but broadcast television, you can address pretty much anything now. And Rod Serling is owed a gigantic debt for that. Rod Serling was the guy who was pushing television to grow up and address these things. And he talked about it over and over again, and he tried over and over again. And he didn't always succeed, but he succeeded in posterity because now you can do those things. And I think, listen, again, there's a lot, we have 300 channels now, so there's a lot of crap on television too, but he would be amazed at how adult and how much quality there is in drama on television today.
Right. And, the thing too is, he really was a whipping boy for the time. But I think he would wear those stripes proudly at this point.
He wore them proudly then too. He really did. He did not mind being the whipping boy. He put himself out there. He put his head on the chopping block himself, and and if they chopped it off, go right ahead, because he was willing to take that stand.
Well, and that's the thing. Beyond that, in a time of McCarthyism, he really was an American hero on so many different levels, and people tend to forget that. He really loved his country. I mean, he was also a worldly man, but he loved us for our freedoms, and he also was very much about trying to safeguard anyone who would try to impede those freedoms for nefarious means.
Absolutely, and artistic freedoms particularly, yes. Exactly. Absolutely.
Well, listen, Nick, man, I appreciate having you on. I'm getting ready to start my little outro music, and if you want to stick around for a second, I'll talk to you off air.
Sounds good, Steve. Thanks.
All right. And again, that book is Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination by Nick Parisi, and you can get that in hardcover. Check it out. I'm going to have to myself, but go out and enjoy the day, spend some time with your family, and just try to love each other. But as the sun sinks low and the shadows grow long, make sure to check under your bed and your closet. Maybe peek out your back pantryway. There might be a spooky little godchild there getting ready to throw you out in the cornfield. But who knows? There might be something of great wonder and imagination for you to experience. So have a great day, but don't be afraid to be a little scared. And until next time, stay safe, everybody.